שלום לכם ותודה על השתתפותכם. אנחנו בערב השני של הכנס הבינלאומי ה-14 של המכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי. אחרי שנה תרופה שעברה על כולנו, הכנס עומד בסימן של ביטחון לאומי באי סדר עולמי ופנימי. אמש, בערב הפתיחה, עסקנו באתגרי הביטחון של ישראל לצד הסכמי הנורמליזציה, המעידים על שינוי אדיר שהתחולל במזרח התיכון בעשור האחרון. הערב נפנה מבט אל העולם המשתנה, לתוכו אנו נכנסים עם תחילתה של שנת 2021. תקופת טראמפ הייתה סוערת וניפצה מוסכמות רבות בסדר העולמי. נכנסנו השבוע לעידן ממשל ביידן, שככל הנראה ינסה לשקם את כללי המשחק הקודמים ולייצב את הסדר העולמי. בד בבד נבחן את מאזן הכוחות במזרח התיכון והתחרות בין 4 צירים: האיראני שיעי, הטורקי אחי מוסלמים, הסלאפי ג'יהאדי וציר חדש של המדינות הסוניות הפרגמטיות והאחראיות השואפות ליציבות ולחיבור עם ישראל, כפי שהומחש לנו בהסכמי אברהם. ננסה לענות על תפקידה של ישראל באזור ומהם האתגרים העומדים בפנינו. נתחיל במעטפת הגלובלית. אין טוב מתומס פרידמן, הפרשן המוביל של יורק טיימס, כדי לנסות ולסרטט לנו את האתגרים הגלובליים שעומדים לפתחו של ממשל ביידן ושל העולם כולו בשנת 2021. Good evening, Tom. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Udi, thank you very much. Great to be back with my friends at INSS. I'm sorry it's virtual, but I look forward to us resuming in person next year. The team asked me to talk a little bit about what's the biggest global trend I see going on right now. And I think the biggest global trend I see going on right now is that the world isn't just flat. It's actually fragile. The world's gotten really fragile. Why do I say that? Well, when the pandemic began last year, I started looking around at what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so as a columnist and reporter. All I'd actually been doing is covering pandemics. Pandemics have become us. How so? Well, first there was the 9/11 pandemic, geopolitical pandemic. Then there was the 2008 financial pandemic. Then there was the 2019 biological pandemic. And staring us in the face is an upcoming atmospheric pandemic called climate change. Every 7-8 years now, we're being hit by a global event with different kinds of pathogens, biological, political, that are actually just rattling the whole world and forcing us all to kind of take a time out. So as I reflected on that, I sat back and thought, why is that happening? Why does the world feel not just flat, but fragile? And the reason it's happening is that what we've been doing over the last 20 years is connecting more nodes in the world, making the world flatter than ever, greasing the connection between those nodes, but at the same time removing the buffers, the surge protectors, the things that can manage the flow between those nodes. And when you do that, and then human beings continue to do the crazy things they always do, you actually end up with a much more fragile world. So let me explain, because what's so interesting about what's happened over the last actually 30 years almost, is that in each case, we had a warning heart attack, and then we had the full coronary. So let's start. Let's first look at the geopolitical pathogen. In 1993, a radical Islamist extremist named Ramzi Youssef packed a truck full of explosives, parked it under the World Trade Center, building number 1. And fortunately, the detonation had a limited effect. It only killed half a dozen people, but it wounded 1,000. That was the warning heart attack. In 2001, we had the full coronary. In 1998, a hedge fund in Connecticut called Long-Term Capital Management managed to build up $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in leverage, a small little hedge fund, managed to build up $1 trillion in leverage. And in 1998, when Russia defaulted and completely upset the interest rate market, long-term capital management started to melt down and threatened to take all of Wall Street with it. Only coordinated action by the Federal Reserve and Wall Street banks prevented that from becoming a giant global economic meltdown. That was our warning heart attack. In 2008, we had the full coronary. In 2002, a coronavirus, a respiratory virus, emerged in Guangzhou, China. It was called SARS-CoV-1. SARS-CoV-1 began to spread around Guangzhou, and then a doctor from Guangzhou flew to Hong Kong, stayed in a hotel, stayed in room 911. Can't make that up. And SARS-CoV-1 exploded out of China into Southeast Asia. Again, thanks to coordinated international action, we were able to limit its impact. And then, of course, in 2019, we got the full coronary. Today, we are getting multiple warning heart attacks about climate change. Much more intense forest fires, much more rapid ice melt in the two poles, warming of oceans and destruction of coral reefs. Everywhere you turn, you see the warning heart attacks on climate change. And the really scary thing is if the full coronary comes on climate change, there is no herd immunity. There's just an endless pounding on the herd. And there is also no vaccination for climate change. So we really need to take these warning heart attacks seriously. So what's going on? In each of these cases, we had a warning heart attack we ignored, and then we got the full coronary. Well, what's going on, as I said, is that we are wiring the world. People stop me and ask me, Friedman, is the world still flat? Oh, baby, it is flatter than ever. We are wiring more places than ever before. We're greasing the connections between those places, making the connections faster than ever before. But then what are we doing? We're actually removing at the same time the buffers, the filters, the surge protectors that can manage the flow between all these nodes and prevent instability or craziness in one corner from transmitting to the whole system. So where did SARS-CoV-1 happen? It happened in Guangzhou. Why did it happen there? Because rapid development and urbanization in China began to invade more and more wilderness areas. And when that development happened in these wilderness areas, what the developers did was basically kill the apex predator in each of these ecosystems and leave behind just the generalized species of bats, rats, and primates who can live in degraded ecosystems. Now, these bats, rats, and primates actually evolved over millennia. They co-evolved with these coronaviruses. They co-evolved with these viruses over many, many years. But when we then come in, kill the apex predator, these then generalized species proliferate. Then the Chinese would actually hunt these species, bring them into wet markets in places like Guangzhou and Wuhan, where they would be sold alongside domesticated meat, and where one of these species would either bite a domesticated animal, bite a human being, or be bitten into by a domesticated animal or human being. And suddenly these coronaviruses that evolved in the wilderness, never meant to be exposed to human beings, jumped zoonotically from these generalized species into humans. In 2002, that's what gave us SARS-CoV-1. And of course, in 2019, that gave us SARS-CoV-2. But the system now is so much more greased. Between December 2019 and March 2020, there were 3,200 direct flights from China to the United States. 3,200. There were 50 direct flights between Wuhan and the United States, where the virus started. Wuhan. How many Americans have ever even heard of Wuhan? So again, we removed the buffers and we greased the world, and suddenly a little virus that emerges in Guangzhou, China, can get transmitted to the entire system. And of course, today, what's going on with climate change? We are literally removing physical buffers, rainforests, polar ice. Polar ice is very important because that white ice actually reflects the sun's rays back into space, so they don't hit the oceans everywhere and warm and boil the oceans. Removing mangroves that limit the impact of hurricanes and whatnot, other sea storms. We're everywhere you turn, and then of course, radically expanding our emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. All of these things are actually weakening our resilience and our buffers to climate change. We're getting the warning heart attacks now every day. And as I say, God save us from the full coronary, because there is no herd immunity to climate change and there is no vaccination. So that is why I say, my friends, the world today is not just flat. It's more and more fragile. And unless we take a step back as a global collective and understand the implications of flattening the world, wiring it together, connecting more and more nodes, greasing the connections between those nodes, but at the same time, removing the buffers and surge protectors that can prevent instability from one node being transmitted to the whole system, we're going to get more and more of these warning heart attacks and full coronaries. I know there's a lot of curiosity right now as to whether the Biden administration is alive to this situation and what the difference will be between it and the Trump administration. And I am encouraged that we are returning to our normal multilateral approach to the world. Because one thing I know for sure, I don't know what is fully sufficient to prevent the next pandemic, but I know what is necessary. And the only way you can prevent these pandemics is with global collaboration around the financial, ecological, and geopolitical buffers and surge protectors that we need to ensure that a world that is getting more tightly wound together and more rapidly greased together, that this world is not so fragile. The only way you do that is through multilateralism. And while it's still very early in this administration, I think the fact that it is returning to the Paris Climate Agreement, the fact that it wants to work with allies on financial regulation, the fact that it wants to work with allies in dealing with global geopolitical issues, I am encouraged that at least we're going to put in place the diplomatic structures again to try to manage this world in a way that it can get flatter without becoming more fragile, without taking really conscious and intentional efforts to preserve our surge protectors and strengthen our regulatory buffers. Our world is not just going to be flatter, it's going to be so much more fragile. Thank you very much. Great to be with you all again.